It is kind of quiet in here without Scott. Hans, do you want to talk about movies? No? Oh, he's saying we should just start the show. I'm getting the wrap-up signal. Okay. Okay, is it time for Sound Politics? Okay. Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkman. Scott's out this week, so we are getting right down to business. None of this dilly-dallying that Scott's usually bring into the show. It's been dubbed muzzle velocity, or a blizzard. Fast and expansive changes to the federal government during President Trump's first 100 days in office. Immigration policy, tariffs, even the size of the federal workforce has been drastically altered. We've talked to Democrats about this change and heard words like disaster or catastrophe. Trump critics on the left are numerous and loud here in Washington state. But what about the right side of the political spectrum? Almost 45% of our electorate voted for a Republican for governor last year. How are conservatives feeling about the direction of the country 100 days into Trump 2.0? To get into that, I'm joined today by a panel of Washingtonians on the right side of the aisle. Former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna, Steve Gordon, principal of Gordon Truck Centers and co-founder of Project 42, and Todd Myers, vice president of research at the Washington Policy Center. Todd and Rob, welcome back. And Steve, welcome to the show.
Yeah,
Great
thanks
to be
for
here.
having
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're going to run through issue by issue here, four main buckets: immigration, tariffs, DOJ, and executive power. But first off, on a high level, if you were going to give a letter grade to President Trump on his first 100 days, what would it be? And Steve, we'll start with you and go around the horn.
Well, I listened to your interview with Congresswoman Del Bene, and of course she didn't have a grade because it was so bad. So I think representing the pro-Trump faction, I should be able to say it's utopia, and there's no grade that can describe how fantastic the world is that Trump has ushered in.
Is that how you really feel?
No, I'd probably give him a B.
And Todd?
I'd give him a C.
C. And Rob, what do you think about grading the Trump 2.0 100 days?
Well, it depends how you weight the issues. I mean, overall, I'd give him a D, but I think he's done better on some issues than others. Some issues have been really terrible, but on other issues like immigration, in terms of border control, he would get a higher grade.
All right, B, C, D. We didn't plan this, but you guys, took your different letters here, so we'll keep that as a baseline as we move along. Immigration, central to the Trump campaign in the first presidency and also for this election. Trump pledged to deport 1 million people a year. Sometimes on the campaign trail, it ended up being millions. The administration's unlikely to reach that goal, but part of that is because illegal border crossings have plummeted. What is your assessment of the president's immigration policy so far and how he's doing in terms of his goals? Todd, let's go with you.
Well, he's starting out doing something that's very radical, which is following the law. It is illegal for people to cross the border without going through immigration. And so just simply following the law, that's very different than what the Biden administration did. The Biden administration did not follow the law. Deporting people who are here illegally is what the law says. So if you want to change the law, then change it. The Obama administration talked a lot about changing it. They had Congress that could do it, and they didn't do it for whatever reason. So currently, that's what the law is. Where I think he has gone wrong is trying to expand using a law from 1798, right, to deport people.
The Alien Enemies Act, yeah.
Yep, and then violating due process, violating a court order, violating the Supreme Court ordering him to do. And that, I think, is where they have gone too far. And that's what I think you will see. And with a lot of the things that the Trump administration has done is that there's some merit to the arguments of, immigration and their immigration policy and following the law. I tend to be a little bit more pro-immigration because we need immigrant labor, both whether it's Microsoft or whether it's farm workers in Eastern Washington. Immigration is great for all of those things, but we need to get the law and we need to follow the law in the way it is done. And I think some of the things that he has shot himself in the foot is when he has gone beyond the law and tried to expand it.
Rob McKenna, I think the Trump administration might look at the failures of Congress in terms of changing the law over the years and say it's time for the executive to act, and I'm empowered. I have a mandate to act on this issue. What say you?
Well, I think he does have a mandate to act on border control. And the fact that they've been able to basically shut down illegal border crossings in the first 100 days is very telling. It's telling about the Biden administration's sort of overt decision to not do that as much as anything. Similarly, deporting people who are here already, who have, for example, overstayed their visas, is something that is within the federal government's executive branch's purview. So that's amounts to enforcing the law. I agree with Todd that trying to use the Alien Enemies Act it doesn't make sense, doesn't hold up under any kind of basic legal analysis. And then in terms of a positive policy, I would ask, what about legal immigration? This country is special because of immigration over the years. A huge percentage of Silicon Valley founders are foreign born, but then a huge percentage of people doing really important work in this country in the agricultural sector and construction elsewhere are also foreign born. We need a certain number of legal immigrants, and I don't see a coherent policy for legal immigration.
Steve, there has been this echoing of some of the criticisms of the Trump administration from the first go-around with family separations, as we see some of the ways in which they're going after what they promised, criminals, people who have criminal records, but then also in order to meet their goals, expanding this to, people who have overstayed visas, things like what Rob just suggested. Critics on the left point to like these kids who were put on the plane to Honduras with their moms. One of them had cancer, saying basically this is about speed and not about accuracy or keeping America safe. How do you feel about how the immigration policy has been pursued under Trump so far? And is this going too far too fast?
I think the optics of that aren't great. But then I think when you dig a little deeper, you say, well, a 2-year-old and the mom is being deported for whatever reason. She was here not legally. If she had other places that she could place her 2-year-old child, then that would have been an option. She didn't. And so the headline becomes, they're deporting 2-year-olds. Well, the mom's being deported and there's no place else for that child to live in our country, can return later.
Yeah. In one case, it was like a dad who says he wanted to keep the kid, but they went too fast.
Yeah. Then that shouldn't happen. But then you get situations like, there was obviously this issue up in Bellingham where 37 workers were, the business was kind of impacted, and they said they couldn't hire American workers, so they were hiring people that were illegal. They were doing it fraudulently. And say what you want about that issue, but what about all the other competitors of that business that are playing by the rules? They're gaming the system and gaining an unfair advantage. So that's where I get into, some of what Todd touched on with just follow the law.
Yeah.
And this prosecutorial discretion isn't really meant to apply to whole big areas of the law. I mean, there's things that are like nuisance things that we don't bust people for littering on a sidewalk or, spitting their gum out like in Singapore. But, that's a big issue is if you're employing people illegally, then you probably are leaving yourself open. And it's unfair to other people that are playing by the rules.
Some people would compare crossing the border without documentation to that because it's a civil infraction at the bottom line. And they would say that, going after people, disrupting families, things like that, it's too far right now. I'm curious what you think about from the business perspective when you do hear that roofing company say, we can't find American workers. What do you think is the solution to making sure that businesses have the workforces they need? I mean, we hear about like construction in America, it's a third, immigrant workforce. So it's not like we can deport everybody and keep building houses at the rate we have to work, right? Like from a business perspective, how do you want immigration policy to be pursued in the future to make it predictable and sustainable for businesses?
Well, I'd like to see us make sure we have, the workforce is sitting at home on their couch, not participating in our economy. And that's a real thing. There's 7 to 10 million able-bodied people that aren't participating. Let's find ways to get them off the couch and get them to work. And do you feel like U.S. policy is contributing to that? Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
I think, it's kind of crazy to think of how the Republican and Democratic parties have traded places on this issue. If, coming from the 80s where, generally Republicans were more pro-immigration and Democrats didn't want immigration. They didn't want cheap labor because they wanted to protect union jobs. Now we've kind of switched places. If you were transported in a time machine from the 80s labor policy of both parties, they wouldn't recognize where we're at today. So I don't think we should be importing low-skill, massive amounts of cheap labor. I think we should selectively look at that. Certainly, agriculture is an area where that has been a successful path to citizenship, and that's fine. But in my own industry, where I came from in the trucking business, for instance, we had to comply with having U.S. citizens. And then there was a subsequent rule that was implemented where truck drivers no longer had to be able to read or write English. That has been disastrous. And that, we need people that can read street signs driving heavy trucks. That's one of the EOs that the Trump administration has put back in place to undo what has been really damaging. So I think if we apply some common sense on this, we'd be in a lot better place than just each picking our political corner and coming out fighting.
Let me just add, you had mentioned that some people see that, crossing the border illegally as a civil infraction. Okay, that's fine. Washington State just finished its session, passed a whole ton of civil infractions that I think if you said, well, we actually are not going to follow that law because it's just a civil infraction. Yeah. We get to make a decision about whether we follow it or not. That's not how laws work. You can't run a system where you just say, well, we think that in this case we're going to ignore it and in this case we're going to follow it. Follow the law. You want to change it? Great. Change the law. Our immigration law needs changing. So change it. But just to arbitrary, one of the challenges of the Trump administration is that their decisions, especially in economics, and we'll talk about tariffs, has been arbitrary. If you start doing that with the rule of law and ignoring immigration infractions is arbitrary and ignoring the rule of law, then you go down a path that we really don't want to go down.
I want to ask Rob to join in on this because I think that immigration policy is a place where Democrats, people on the left, and critics on the right have pointed to as the flashpoint between the judiciary and the executive branch under Trump. The Kilmar Abrego-Garcia case, Supreme Court saying that he needs to facilitate Abrego-Garcia's release from El Salvador. They have made no moves to do that so far, the Trump administration. The showdown that's going on right now between the Supreme Court and Trump, what's your take on this, Rob? Where do we go from here? What does it mean if Trump continues to ignore the court's part of the order on this?
Well, it's very concerning. We have three separate but equal branches of government. And an executive branch that refuses to comply with judicial branch orders is a branch which is violating the Constitution. So I think this is really problematic legally and constitutionally, and also I think ultimately politically for the Trump administration, because this is a Supreme Court of his making. And if this court with people like Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and others, say, look, you need to follow the law. Here's what the law is, and they don't follow it. I think it'll undercut Trump's credibility. He can't claim this is a court that's full of rogue justices. He created as much as anyone. So I think that's a problem. But the bigger problem is the problem of just refusing to comply with lawful judicial orders. But this hasn't played itself out yet entirely. I think we've got a ways to go. Well, I think that Trump and his people are testing the limits, and we'll have to see how hard the courts push back. I think they're going to push back pretty hard.
Anybody want to add anything before we move on Kilmar Abrego-Garcia, the judicial stuff, anything?
I would just add that.
Yeah, Steve.
It's not the best poster boy to make your case on, right? And so that's problematic for hey, we believe in the rule of law and we need due process, and this is somebody that is kind of a bad actor. Everybody's going down.
But how do we know he's a bad actor? Tell me more about that, because there's been misinformation. Like Trump in that ABC interview thought that his knuckles literally said MS-13.
Yeah,
that's not true.
And there's that those were symbols that, maybe stood for it. I don't know. I'm not getting into those details.
But to be clear, he doesn't have MS-13 written on his knuckles.
His wife filed a couple protection orders against him. He was not a great guy. He was beating up his wife, basically, is what his own wife said. So, we've got a whole parade of Democratic politicians going to El Salvador to argue for his release. Where are they going? Why aren't they going to Israel and Gaza, harbor, wanting to release U.S. citizens that are still held by Gazans?
You think it's a misappropriation of attention, of resources? I mean, but you don't.
It doesn't make the best case. From an optics standpoint.
But at the baseline, you don't think that somebody who's necessarily a bad guy doesn't deserve due process. Isn't due process the baseline?
Should be, but absolutely. But if this is your poster boy for due process, you're losing it in the war of public opinion.
Well, I'll just say, the people who need due process most are not good people.
Yeah, no,
right.
That's true.
I mean, those are the situations where you're going to have these fights. And again, I think all of those things are true. So let the courts decide, and that's what the courts are for. And so the courts have said bring him back, and then if you want to go through the process and redeport him, and the courts say yes, do it. That's the thing. So I think that the fact that he is not a good guy or a member of MS-13, I don't want gang members. I don't want people who are doing that in the country if they shouldn't be here. So do it the right way. I will say one of the things that frustrates me about there's an irony in that just 1 year ago, one of the major messages of the left was the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court, that it was a Trump, it was a right-wing court.
They were going to pack the court.
It was illegitimate. They wanted to pack the court. Yeah. And now they are thanking God for the Supreme Court,
for Amy Coney Barrett,
exactly.
And Brett Kavanaugh.
So, people can be frustrated about what the Trump administration is doing, but they also need to say, okay, when Trump is gone, am I going to be consistent in my principles, and am I going to learn from this, or am I just going to reflexively root for my team? And I see way too much team spirit right now.
Let's talk about trade policy, and I want to ask a question. Are American kids going to have $2 or $30 for Christmas this year? Okay. This is just a comment by Trump during a cabinet meeting yesterday. He said yesterday it would be $2. They might be a little more expensive, but China will be worse off ultimately. Tariffs are, a central conversation right now, central piece of President Trump's economic goals for a long time. He's finally kind of had the free rein to implement them. It's hard to tell what the goal is. We've had some unpredictability here, to say the least. That is also skewing economic data, which I found interesting. So in one quarter, U.S. GDP went from net growth to net decline, we just heard yesterday. However, that number's cloudy because people were buying up cars. They were trying to get ahead of these things with their inventory, with their parts, get ahead of the tariffs. So other indicators show that there's been a slowdown in the economy, but not a contraction. This is only through the end of March. I'll start with Rob. What do you see as the president's goals for tariffs? And do you think he's on the right track?
Well, no, I don't think he's on the right track with tariffs in the way he's handled them. I think in general, I think that dealing with China dumping large amounts of manufactured goods in our country and in other countries is a legitimate problem. And the fact is, America has become hooked on cheap manufactured goods from China. And the risk is that we'll become hooked on much more valuable manufactured goods from China. I mean, it's already true with iPhones, but they want to dominate the world in automobile exports, including electric vehicles. That would be a significant problem. And they're massively subsidizing their EV industry in order to undercut the rest of the world's market. This all is in violation of norms for trade. They were invited into the World Trade Organization because everyone at the time in the EU and the United States working on that policy thought that this would liberalize China's approach to trade. It hasn't. They've exploited the system. So if we're talking about dealing with harms being inflicted on our economy by China's policies, then I think measured responses to that make sense. But where I think Trump has gone off the rails, and I think what Americans intuitively understand is that applying tariffs all over the place, and high tariffs against Mexico, against Canada, against the EU,
against allies.
Exactly. That they need to. Everyone, I think, intuitively understands that tariffs are a tax. This is a set of very large tax increases on goods that we import. And there are a couple of, there's one stated goal for this, and there's one goal that doesn't get as much airtime. The stated goal is to return manufacturing jobs to the United States. Well, manufacturing jobs now account for 8% of American jobs. And this is reminiscent of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where the stated goal was to reverse a decline in agricultural employment. That was actually a big impetus for Smoot-Hawley. We had been a country with a very high percentage of the workforce working in agriculture. It had declined dramatically by 1930, and the forces for agriculture and for farms were very powerful. But now we look back and say, why in the world would we want to tax ourselves on everything in order to protect ag jobs? Now the question has to be, how many manufacturing jobs should we have, and are we willing to tax ourselves to try to bring back manufacturing jobs? That's the part of this debate that gets the most airtime. The part that doesn't is that people like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, believe that the trade deficit in goods has resulted in a subsidy of the U.S. national debt. It's made it easier for us to grow the debt. I think that is probably accurate, because all those dollars that are being paid out for imports have to go somewhere, and treasuries are one of the places they go.
Yeah, people buy bonds.
I think it's true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. So I think there's clearly a fundamental effort underway with Trump and his advisors to restructure the American economy and global trade. And I think what they haven't sufficiently appreciated is how disruptive it is because of the way it's being executed and how expensive it's going to be. And we need to have an honest and open conversation about how much we're all willing to pay in terms of higher prices for goods in order to protect a certain category of jobs.
Okay, Rob McKenna, we've hit the bingo card of Smoot-Hawley, Scott Bessent. We've talked about the bond market. Steve Gordon, what do you think about these tariffs and how much Trump seems to think that Americans can go through some suffering this Christmas, and that ultimately they're going to focus on the long-term gain and China will be the one to fold? I mean, what do you think about that?
I'm going to say a sentence I've never said in my life. I agreed with Pramila Jayapal's take on tariffs, that they should be targeted and used tactically or strategically.
Okay, clip that. We're going to be replaying that on NPR.
That's going to cost me my Republican Party card. So I guess, first of all, there's the practical ramifications and the psychological part. It's something that I've never been a fan with Trump, but this is how he does things. He is a bombastic New York negotiator. This was the big first ask, right? I happened to be in D.C. the day after Liberation Day, and even people in the White House were kind of rolling their eyes going, I don't know what he's doing, but we'll figure it out. So it was the big first ask to get everybody's attention. He got everybody's attention, not necessarily in a good way. I do think that, as we've kind of dialed down from we're going to tariff the whole world, which is a tax and cost people, consumers real money, focusing on China is good. China has stolen our IP repeatedly. They employ slave labor. They have no environmental standards. There's a lot of reasons we don't want to outsource all of our manufacturing to them. But the other thing I would say, and I was talking to some Republican senators 2 weeks ago about this. I said, so now we're bringing all these jobs back. Which one of you is going to tell the American public that it's all the manufacturing is all going to be automated and your iPhone's going to cost $6,000? Because we can't make cheap stuff. I do a bunch of work in the venture space, and China's like the only game in town. Vietnam's kind of doing some stuff, but unless we want to buy $100 T-shirts, there's a labor arbitrage to be had with lower skilled work around the world, and I don't think. We're not ready, and nor do we want a lot of those back. We need to have strategic manufacturing back, and we need to recognize the trade-offs with that, because the same people that are really up in arms and want to embrace the EV future and, boy, we need to worry about climate change, are perfectly willing to outsource that to China, where they don't have labor standards and they don't have environmental standards, but they would never let us touch an ounce of raw minerals in our country. So how do we square that circle?
Todd, the idea of, I forget the comedian's name who said it, Americans want to wear Nikes, they don't want to make Nikes, right? Are you in line here as a free markets guy with what Steve's saying?
Yeah. So one of the things that I always ask people is, at what year did the United States reach its peak in manufacturing output? Not jobs, but output. And people always say the 50s or other times like that. No, it's this year. Right. The last year, we are at the peak of manufacturing, and it's sort of plateaued since COVID for a whole range of reasons. But we have not lost our manufacturing base. The same thing has happened to manufacturing that happened to agriculture, which is it mechanized, it automated, and so you were able to produce more with fewer people, and people have moved into the services sector. So if you quote, bring more manufacturing, you may create more jobs, but you'll probably create more output, but costs will be higher. There won't be that many jobs. And that's by choice in a lot of ways. And I think the fundamental misapprehension of both the Trump administration and Congresswoman Jayapal is that politicians can accurately decide what strategic and targeted tariffs are. I mean, I think it's very difficult for them to know, we're going to do 25% on this country and it's going to yield these outcomes. It simply hasn't. The Trump
even on China?
And there are arguments you can make about national security, about violation of patents and intellectual property and things like that. And yes, do something, but recognize that it is a blunt instrument. And I think that there is this sense that we can calibrate our tariff policy or economic policy, and that government and politicians can say, well, here's the goal we want to achieve, and we're going to turn these knobs to do it. That doesn't work. In the first Trump administration, they got into a trade war with China, said, okay, we've now worked it out. They're going to buy more of our agricultural goods. Guess what? They did not, in fact, buy more of our agricultural goods. So it's very difficult. And the more that you believe that the president or Congress or other people should sit there and fiddle with the dials and say, 100%, 112%, 10%. And that's going to be effective at achieving the goals you want, it's proven again to be, time and again to be wrong. Now, you can say, well, we have a national security problem. I think we should be putting a hell of a lot of sanctions on Russia. That will raise costs, right? We don't get their oil. There's a price to pay for that. But for national security and other reasons, it's a good thing. But you've got to recognize those trade-offs. And I think that there is this thinking that occurs in the minds of people on the left and right that, we can tariff and it will create more jobs and we'll be more wealthy. And that just doesn't turn out to be the case. And what ends up happening is that you get the worst of both worlds, because when push comes to shove, politics starts to take over. And then they say, okay, tariffs are off. Oh, tariffs are back on. Yeah. And that's why we have seen that, is because what is driving it when push comes to shove is political decisions, not a coherent economic policy.
Well,
quick response, Rob McKenna, just hearing
Sure.
you. Yeah, go ahead.
A data point and an observation. The data point is to reinforce something Todd said. We have about the same number of jobs in automobile manufacturing in the United States today that we did in the early 1990s before NAFTA. There may be fewer jobs in Michigan, more of them are in Tennessee, but it's the same number of jobs. So what exactly are we trying to do here? Second, an observation. I think China is a problem. I think the EU is increasingly recognizing, and other countries around the world are recognizing they're a real problem. One way we can address China, at which Trump is not pursuing in the right way, is to reach deals with other countries to encourage more manufacturing in those countries, other countries in Southeast Asia, for example. In other words, diversify away from a reliance on Chinese manufactured goods. That is a better strategy. That's why Mexico and Canada are really valuable to us, because we have a really integrated supply chain with them now for automobile manufacturing. But 30% of the value of a car assembled in Mexico comes from the United States. 3% of a manufactured good in China is attributed to the United States. So I think Todd's right. This policy that he's been pursuing, this blunderbuss policy, it's not working, and it's not the right policy to begin with in terms of this broad use of tariffs against our allies as well as our opponents.
Steve Gordon.
Two quick things. not all trade deficits are bad. I think it's good to have a trade deficit with Switzerland. We want Swiss chocolate. A trade deficit with the French and French wine. Great. Those are fantastic things. It doesn't necessarily bad on its face. But I do think part of the argument, and it's a credible argument, is reciprocal tariffs. If somebody else is taking unfair advantage in some way manipulating it, then I think we have a right to fight back. That's the only
Let me
thing.
ask, was blunderbuss on the bingo card?
No,
Yeah,
it was
it
not,
should
but
be.
now I'm mad it wasn't. You would get extra points, or Rob would get extra points.
I don't use those highfalutin words like Rob.
Yeah, that's extra vocab points. So really quick before we move on from tariffs, Steve, because you're wearing the Trump shirt today, I want to ask, polling has started to reflect people are not happy with Trump's approach to this. And the economy used to be his strength. Now we're seeing he's underwater. Do you think that this is something that could be a real problem for him in the future, or for Republicans who are riding on the Trump train? He's in his second term.
Could be a problem. I was talking to a friend that is in the investment space that's a well-known public figure, and we were talking about this and how dumb some of this is. And I made the point, and he agreed. He says, somehow Trump kind of lands, he's like a cat. He lands on his feet on some of these things, and you don't think he ever could. So I am not willing to say that it will be forever bad. It's certainly temporarily not great. And we rely on international trade. I come from the supply chain world where we did a lot of import work. And so how that all shakes out, I'm not sure. This is probably the only area that keeps me from giving him an unabashed A.
So that's where your B came from.
Yeah.
You're listening to Sound Politics. We're hanging out on the right side of the aisle this week with former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna, Steve Gordon with Gordon Truck Centers, and Todd Myers of the Washington Policy Center, all conservatives based here in Washington. When we talk about Donald Trump and his first 100 days, Elon Musk plays an outsized role, and how much Trump has empowered Elon Musk to go after the federal bureaucracy through DOGE. It's something that came out fast and furious at the start of this administration. Now we've seen Elon say he's going to step back, but just to run through some numbers here, DOGE claims to have found $160 billion in savings for the American taxpayers. The goal initially was $2 trillion. That has been severely downgraded. The waste, fraud, and abuse is much smaller than what we initially were told. Nearly 250,000 workers have either been fired or accepted that deferred resignation program. That's almost half and half, according to Politico. DOGE has closed or hollowed out 11 federal agencies. Remarkably, federal spending under Trump is still up compared to the first quarter of 2024, and that's confusing to me. Democrats say that the underlying motive of Musk and DOGE is not efficiency. They say it's a power grab. Todd Myers, what do you think about DOGE, about how they've approached things, and how Trump has relied on Elon Musk in this way?
I think it's telling that they say it's a power grab, because what they assume is that there is existing power that is against Trump in the government, which is Trump's own argument.
Well, to be clear, it's Congress that that funds these agencies, like USAID. The closure of that should have been approved by Congress. That's the power grab I think they're trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that Democrats distinguish themselves as having Congress stand up to the president when the president was theirs either. So I think they make a good point about the weakness of Congress. But one of the things that I remember about the first Trump administration is that when he was elected, there was an article that said EPA worries about Trump presidency. And I said, there is no such thing as the EPA that is independent of the president of the United States. The agencies work for the person that is elected by the people of the country, in the same way that the agencies in Washington state work for the governor.
But the funding is approved by Congress and appropriated and allocated, right? That's where the separation of powers argument comes in. So
yes, I think that's true. I think that, but you can also cut funding. You are not obliged to spend money wastefully because you have it. It is a longstanding rule in government that, like, if Congress says, okay, we're going to give $5 million to achieve this goal, and government says we can achieve it in $2 million, you are not obliged to then hand $3 million more to people. And so there are places you can cut. There is waste, and agencies have, and the administration has discretion all the time about look, you give us money, here's the things we're going to achieve. As long as we are achieving these things, then we will use our budget. And sometimes there is money left over and sometimes there isn't. All of that is fair game. The question about how much of that can be done. Can you eliminate agencies that Congress says you must do this? No. Clearly, if you're violating the law, if you're violating what Congress says and what has been adopted, then you can't do that. But I can tell you, I worked at a state agency. I think government does many good things. I also saw many things we should not have been doing, areas that were waste. And is there $2 trillion in waste in the federal government? No. Is there $160 billion in waste in the federal government? Absolutely. And even if you say we should be spending the same level, right? Even if you say, all right, I actually like the spending, government should be in charge, then you should want money to be spent effectively. You should say, why aren't we solving this problem or that problem or cleaning up rivers or doing things for the environment in my area? Why are we wasting money on bureaucracy and things that don't work when there are things that need funding? So everybody should look at it and say, we need to stop wasting money. And the fact that government waste has become a partisan issue, I think, is really bad.
But I think the reason it's become partisan is because it's been seen as exerting a type of executive power that is, according to Trump's goals, like cutting NIH funding, which people are saying this is going to really harm our future of scientific research, of health research, cutting USAID. This is something that in the past was bipartisan, but Trump saw as kind of a separate power center in the federal government. What do you think, Steve, about the way that DOGE has gone about this and, Trump's belief in Elon? Now maybe that's eroded and Elon is also seeing his profits go down and he's stepping back.
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, as Todd and you both recognize, Congress, appropriates the money. And that's what's going on right now is Congress, we're working off of the past of appropriations. That's what the CR is all about. So they haven't had a chance to implement a Republican-led budget yet. So that's coming. But they're setting the stage for it by making these changes in the executive branch where they can. And what Trump recognizes, I think, rightfully, this time that he didn't recognize the first time is he's got to act fast and he has no friends embedded in these agencies. They worked actively against him the first term. And, Elon's been the guy that he tapped on the shoulder to really implement that. They're going in like he did at Twitter when he bought it, now X. They go scorched earth. That's the way that Silicon Valley works. I'm not saying it's right.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's
nobody dies
right.
when Elon goes in scorched earth at Twitter, but like USAID cuts are closing tuberculosis clinics in Thailand. There are people in South Sudan.
I think there's a colorful argument about how much U.S. taxpayer dollars should be bailing out the world when we're $37 trillion in debt. And that we haven't really had that discussion yet. And absolutely, but we can't save every life in the world. We don't have the money. We're broke. The credit card is maxed. And so I think, USAID is a good example where we do need soft power. We do need to be able to interact with people.
That was going to be my question. Is if
absolutely,
you believe in
there is
that.
a vacuum that will be filled by actors like China and Russia in our wake. But we need to do it smart. We don't need to transmice. We don't need to have Sesame Street in Iraq. There was a whole bunch of really bad examples that were in place. So,
but those are such a small fraction, right?
I understand,
such a small
but they
fraction of the spending. Yeah.
But they really make a powerful case for how our federal government spending is out of control, and that's part of how Trump got elected. So he's carrying out the mandate of the people that put him in office, and there's no doubt that Elon Musk has been the form of the destroyer, just like the Stay Puft Michelin Man, or Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. So
I think that when we talk about, waste, fraud, and abuse is something that when voters are asked about this in polls, they universally liked the concept of DOGE. But when they've seen it implemented, they see things like Forest Service workers getting laid off, then rehired, the bird flu people getting laid off, then rehired. There's been this chaos with people, nuclear engineers, things like that create ultimately costs, instability, things that are externalities that are a problem with the way this has been pursued. But Rob McKenna, I want to get your take on this. Is it penny wise, pound foolish what DOGE is doing, or are they exposing something that is real, like a real need to go in with the hatchet?
That Ronald Reagan created a commission called the Grace Commission, led by it was Peter Grace, and they took a scalpel to federal government and accomplished very little. Now you've got the opposite approach with flamethrower, chainsaw, and so my question about it is not only are there real harms being caused by kind of thoughtless cuts made by bros from Silicon Valley, but are the cuts that are valid, that are reductions that are necessary, sustainable or not? Because I don't see when Elon leaves, Doge fades away, that any of this is going to have a lasting impact. That's number one. Number two, what's driving our national debt, which is now at 123% of gross domestic product, is not spending on USAID or NIH or any of that. It's
you're going to touch the third rails. Watch out.
I know. It's entitlements, and it is now interest on the national debt. And I'm very concerned that the administration doesn't want to touch that third rail, as you put it, and yet something has to be done, and it should be done on a bipartisan basis. It was attempted, the last time it was attempted was by President George W. Bush, who decided to spend a good deal of his political capital trying to address Social Security and just got absolutely torched by the Democrats. It was a key moment in Nancy Pelosi's political career, but it was incredibly short-sighted and reckless to undermine an effort to address entitlement spending, which is gobbling up more and more of the federal budget and of the gross national product. We need to make a series of incremental changes to entitlement spending that prevent those programs, Social Security, Medicare, from going bankrupt, and prevent them from bankrupting our country in the process. And that is not being addressed by Doge because they weren't allowed to do it. Trump has said that's off limits. And yet it's the most pressing issue we face. We cannot continue to grow the national debt the way we have been, and you can't address it without addressing entitlement spending.
But besides a very quick conversation that was squashed about raising taxes on millionaires, which surprised me they even were floating it, there doesn't seem to be any real solution, maybe some Medicaid cuts, but even that will involve a lot of fuzzy Congress math in order to make the extension of the tax cuts balance out, right? Like ultimately, this is going to be once this Republican Congress gets going on the budget, this is going to be adding trillions and trillions of dollars ongoing. That nobody really has the political will to actually solve this, right, Rob?
The political will is not there because it has become so thoroughly politicized that as soon as you talk about anything around even the most modest changes to Social Security benefits, for example, raising the retirement age, you're accused by the other side of gutting Social Security. I remember my grandmother years ago being terrified because she saw political ads being run by Democrats in her state who claimed that efforts to address Social Security were going to take away her Social Security. I think that was during the Reagan administration. So, it's possible to make incremental changes that will bend the growth curve and the cost of those entitlements. That's what needs to happen. And one example is gradually raising the retirement age above what it is now.
We got to move on.
Steps that can be taken as well.
Yeah, Rob, but and noted. I do want to get to. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I don't want to not get to these important topics. And it has to do kind of with the executive power, the way that Trump is wielding it. He told supporters that I am your retribution when he came back into office. And since taking office, there were the J6 pardons, targeting of universities, threatening private companies over DEI initiatives and ending DEI in the federal workforce. He's gone after law firms that represented left causes. He's gone after individuals, including from his own administration, who didn't fall in line with the 2020 election denier stuff. He rescinded security clearances for Hillary Clinton, his political rivals. I'll use the word unprecedented because that's something that we love to say in the media. I mean, we just haven't seen an executive move as powerfully, as quickly as this, and using the powers in these ways to go after and really try to reshape many spaces in American life. Todd, I'll start with you. What do you think about the way the president has wielded power and what it means ultimately for American life? Yeah,
I think that the executive branch should have a hell of a lot less power. and Congress should be making most of the decisions. Their Article 1 is Congress for a reason, right? They're supposed to be number one. And right now they are the weakest because they have given up voluntarily their power. This is not about Republican Congress. This was the same thing that was true when Joe Biden was president. But this has been a long-term trend of the executive abusing power. Barack Obama said, I have a pen and a phone. If Congress won't do what I want, I have a pen and a phone. No, you don't get to make decisions because you have a pen and a phone. When Joe Biden was president, he forgave or had the taxpayers assume, more accurately, student loans completely without authority. And when the Supreme Court stopped him, their answer was, the Supreme Court is trying to stop us, but we're going to keep doing it. No, that shows a fundamental desire to abuse the power. I think Donald Trump has taken some of those trends and done all of them at once, right? Which makes it more acute. And he's done them in the first 100 days. But in many of the ways that he has abused power, I can show you corollaries with previous presidents. I really don't like the January 20th commutations and Jan 6 is January 20 is the inauguration. January 6, correct. I really don't like that. I don't like going after law firms that disagree with him. I think that's really abusive. So there's plenty of ways that he has done things to abuse executive power that I don't like, and I think that we need to recalibrate that. But this is not a Donald Trump problem. This is, well, now that I'm in charge, right, we get to do it my way. And that needs to change. And again, for people who don't like what Donald Trump is doing, when 2028 comes around, they need to sit down and say, okay, do I want to constrain my president because I didn't like what Donald Trump does? And if their answer is no, then they're part of the problem.
I think Trump sees especially universities as like a calcified liberal power center that he has to go and bust up. What do you think about that, Steve? Is it overdue that he takes these kinds of actions?
He's carrying out the only way that he can in some way. It's twisted, I know, because the executive shouldn't have this power. I agree with everything Todd said. I disagree with what you think the source is, but I'll touch on that in a second. But the people who voted for him aren't fans of DEI. They aren't fans of boys in girls sports. And based on polling I've seen, 60% of Washingtonians aren't either. I mean, that's not indicative of how they voted for president, but even a certain amount of, kind of independent and left voters say, I don't want that boy playing in my girls' volleyball league. And so Congress isn't going to fix that anytime soon. They're broken. And so he's pushing back on some of the stuff with the only tool at hand. I think it's again, to steal a term from Todd, it's a blunt instrument. It's not a great one in many ways, but that's what his voters wanted. And so he's carrying out the will of people that supported him and the will of a lot of the country. I was this past weekend, I was with 50 policymakers from all around the country and explaining what's going on in places like Washington. I got a mix of disbelief and pity, because this kind of stuff isn't happening all over the country. The things that are going on in Washington, Oregon, California especially, are pretty extreme from the mainstream of the rest of this country. And so,
do you mean like the policies we just talked about? Anything
all
else?
Of the above. We've embraced every far left progressive thing under the sun in comparison to the rest of the country. And it's not where the rest of the country's at. And so, Trump and his administration are pushing back on that. I don't think it's great, but Congress is fundamentally broken. I thought it was hugely ironic to hear Congresswoman DelBene talk about Republicans standing up and opposing this president. Guess who voted with President Biden 100% of the time? Susan DelBene. So there's a penalty to pay. I get it. We are the enemy in this, the people, because we demand a purity test of our politicians. And lo and behold, if you take one wrong vote, we will primary you out of existence. Well, this is what we got.
Rob McKenna.
Well, I think that the January 6th commutations and pardons are inexcusable, especially for folks who are convicted criminals who harmed police officers. I'll never get over that. I think that it was just a raw exercise of political power, and it sets a new high bar. What I mean is it's a new frontier for future presidents to emulate in order to reward their supporters. So I think it's a role.
Hey, Rob, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you got to also mention that, Biden cleared the deck for that with his mass pardon.
I was just getting to that. You're absolutely right about pardoning his son, for example. But still, what Trump did went even farther, right? So I don't think Biden covered himself in glory in any way. I didn't like his pardons either, Steve. You're absolutely right about that. So just to build on a point that Todd made a few minutes ago, what we're seeing is greater and greater power being accumulated in the executive branch. We haven't seen this happen in the way it's happening the last 10 to 20 years since FDR was in office, and it is Congress's failure to reassert its own prerogatives as the Article I branch, the most important branch of government, which is at the core of it. We've become far too reliant on the courts and on the executive branch. And so, secondly, obviously, I'm very concerned about the administration undermining the courts whenever it suits their purposes, because they've already effectively nullified Congress. And if they can do that to the courts as well, then we've really got a problem.
Okay, we are out of time. So I want to give a minute to you each as we wrap up here. I'm really curious about going forward, what you think about Trump's rollover effects in Washington state. I know we've got limited time, so this is probably something we could talk much more extensively about. Do you worry? We've heard criticisms here on the right for the way Trump policy has been going. Maybe let's start with Steve, because you gave him a B at the start. Again, you got the Trump swag on. There's a difference here between, I guess, the true MAGA base and independent voters and how they will be affected by what we see from the administration. How do you think Washington Republicans navigate Trump 2.0? And, is there a chance that they separate, or that they, are selective in their support? Or, what's the way forward basically to be the most effective as a party in Washington state?
Well, I'm wearing this Trump shirt partly in atonement for supporting Ron DeSantis's presidential run. So, just to be clear,
it's like your hair shirt.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I think one of the things that's historically true of Washington Republicans are that we're pretty independent from national movements, and I think we will continue to be. Part of the reason I supported DeSantis over Trump, even though I like a lot of things Trump is doing now, is because I know how much the negative polarization of a Trump presidency impacts our state, right? It just brings out protesters and people that want to draw swastikas on their Teslas now. It's crazy. And that's not helpful for our state. I think where he does things like with the tariffs, I think we should be realistic and sober-eyed about that's not great for our economy, especially one that's this trade dependent. But I think that you have to put it in context of what he went through the first term, what he went through with all the lawsuits. That kind of gets us to the place that we're at, and we'll see how it plays out. I think we push back principally on anybody. And if we don't, then that's part of what's broken in politics.
Rob, just a 30-second answer if you can. Just what do you think about that, how Washington Republicans should navigate Trump?
It's very challenging, because whenever we want to push back against something the Democrats are doing in Olympia, like raising a raft of taxes and creating new taxes, they just say, well, Trump, Trump, Trump. So anyone running as a Republican now has to deal with that. And we need more balance in Olympia, as even the moderate Democrats are being pushed out of office. And it's hard to accomplish that with the national background that sort of dominates people's political thinking.
Yeah, the nationalization of politics, huge theme. Todd, final thoughts?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think how do the Republicans manage it? They can't. As long as Donald Trump is president, he is the head of the Republican Party, and that's the way it's going to be. The thing about it is that we have paid a price for the nationalization, because what ends up happening is that Washington State ends up adopting a lot of bad policies, not meeting our goals. I work in environment. We're not meeting our climate goals. We're not meeting our salmon recovery goals. But then when you bring those things up, what you get is, oh, so you support Trump. And that sort of duality, that sort of, like I said, team spirit papers over a lot of problems we have in Washington State, because you can just make that reflexive argument and we never get to a deal with the problems that we do have.
Todd Myers with the Washington Policy Center. You also heard from Steve Gordon, principal at Gordon Truck Centers and co-founder of Project 42, and former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna. I really appreciate this, you guys. I think that it's something I want to have more often, especially this conversation about how we paper over local issues with the national factor. Really appreciate your perspectives today. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it was very fun. Thank you.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you much.
That's it for Sound Politics today. The show was produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabriel Spitzer, who points out Susan DelBene actually voted with President Biden 98.1% of the time in 2023, according to ABC News. So almost 100%, not quite 100%, just a little fact check. I'm Libby Denkman, and hey, if you listen to this whole episode of Sound Politics, you're obviously a politics person, so maybe consider a donation to keep this show going. There is a link in the show notes or at kuow.org/politics to make that gift. And thank you so much for listening and for your support. We'll see you next week.